Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi. And for episode 4, we have as our guest today, who is a longtime resident of the North Fork. He was a professor at Long Island University in the Department of Anthropology, specializing in Native American studies. He has written numerous books, including Wovoka and the Ghost Dance, Corbett Mac, The Life of a Northern Paiute, and Great Basin Indians, An Encyclopedic History, as well as other books. He's also currently working on a book about the Brooklyn Paramount Theater. So this one's going to be split up into 2 parts as well. We're going to focus on today, he'll be talking about his life growing up in the Lower East Side of New York City, as well as some of the inspiration in his life with music, especially jazz, and some of the characters and role models and people that influenced him over time. So I hope you all enjoy episode 4, part 1 with Michael Hittman. Thank you for coming in today.
Well, thanks, Chris. And probably not the way to start, but I want to say thank you to you first for doing the podcast, but also importantly for helping me with my research. I'm somebody who spent a lot of time in libraries, so this is going to be a bone thrown to you. So please, I can't thank you enough, and the staff at the library here in Greenport, and of course in other libraries. The most wonderful people are reference librarians. Anyone who does research, basically research is just finding out either what everybody else knows, and you can't claim it as your own, that's plagiarism, and or finding out new things. And Chris, you've been really unbelievable in helping me collect books that I've asked you for and promptly getting them from me, and I hope I promptly return them. And I can't thank you enough for that, because I'm working on a book which we'll talk about. And every time I've come to you and getting technical support too, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. No problem. You've been a great patron and library user, and I'm always glad to help you.
So like the problem with this for me is, it's not a problem. I've done, as we'll talk about, radio shows. I've done 173, I think, for NPR. We'll talk about them. And in the course of that, I've interviewed people. And to prepare for that, I've prepared hundreds of hours, read, I don't want to say how many books. I've taken people out for hundreds of hours of lunches to prepare for the show and spend any number of hours on the show. And in all of those, I'll say 175 hours more. Only one person, and his name is Giacomo Gates, and he lives across the bay, across Long Island Sound. He's the only one who stopped me during lunch, because I'm asking him a million questions. Can we talk about this? Can we talk about that? Well, okay, well, he said, hey, man. He said, that's enough about me, man. He said, let me hear something about you. So I said, me? So here I am at the other end of it, rattling away about, I, me, myself, and I. So that's what we'll do today. So that's my other. So I wanted, you gave me a bunch of questions, which we're going to try to answer. Tell me about yourself. And I thought I'd start my answers this way.
Sure.
That wonderful novel by Herman Hesse, which I'll never forget, Narcissus and Goldman. And it dealt with 2 friends. And one friend sees the world as an artist through images. And the other friend sees the world, I don't want to say literally, but through words. So the word book person is talking to the artist picture person. And wherever I am in that, I said, I wanted to start off with these images, these 5 images. One is a five-story tenement, a slum on the Lower East Side where I was raised. So imagine a 5-story building with fire escape in the front. The new law, you had to put fire escapes. And my parents living up on the 5th floor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, on 6th Street between Avenue C and Avenue D. And I say it for a reason, because I believe, I'm not going to talk about God, but I believe in synchronicities. I believe the world is connected. So yesterday, of course, Rosalind Carter died. And course, I'm saying of course, Jimmy Carter took that tenement, that slum, and under Habitat redid it. So it's a beautiful building now. It wasn't so beautiful then. But my roots are these 5 images. One is a 5-story tenement with a bathtub in the kitchen, which my mother, to her, she recently passed, was the only quarrel I ever had with her. Was she said, I never lived in an apartment with a bathtub in the kitchen. And I said, you did, because I remember. She just refused to own up to that. We had a toilet in the apartment, not in the hallway. Yeah. So the tenement, and then a jailhouse, a 5-story jailhouse on 3rd Street, in the same place, the Lower East Side, which was converted into a settlement house, which my father ran. So a second very important part of my life is the fact that my father was a social worker, and he ran a settlement house. So one is a tenement, and one is with basketball court and boxing, and then the third thing was a Hebrew school, which is a converted schoolhouse on East 4th Street, where a large part of my life was shaped, obviously at home, and obviously where my father worked, and then also in this Hebrew school, because they had, quote, RI, religious instruction. I don't know if they do it anymore, but like on a Tuesday or Thursday afternoon, you had to say whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Catholic. There were no Muslims then, and what kind of Catholic, Protestant, Christian, and they would line you up outside of school around 2 o'clock, and then they sent us over to me and a couple of kids got sent to a Hebrew school where I learned how to play basketball, which is another. So we have 3 basically school facilities. The Lower East Side, any place had these amazing schools, which are hardly, like our library, is hardly utilized by the community. And then a 4th thing is a summer camp, because my father's boys club or settlement house came with a summer camp, and that was very important for me for a lot of reasons, because I met and worked for the brother of a very famous jazz musician. So we'll get to role models in a minute, but I had one more image, and so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, now 5. The other image is a candy store. Now, to say that, it's hard to say that to kids who've never had the urban experience, but candy stores were so important in our lives. To get candy, you didn't have email, you didn't, send off for a box of candy. You went to the local candy store, and there were these guys. It was their 24-hour deal. So my grandparents, the point, we asked me about parents and grandparents. My parents were born here in the United States. My father's name is Ralph. My mother's name is Rose. And mostly my mother's parents I was close to, and they owned a candy store. And God bless them, they owned it for 13 years and worked 24/7. Where my grandfather, I didn't see this, I wasn't born yet. My grandfather worked all night, and my grandmother worked all day. And how they met, how they made 8 kids, I won't even, that's maybe a mystery. The candy store was very, very powerful kind of image for lots and lots and lots of reasons. And my grandfather was like an Englishman, because when there were all the pogroms in Europe, which is kind of weird to talk about today, given what's going on in Gaza and all these terrible things over there, but they apparently left during pogroms, and my grandfather wound up in London for 13 years, and he became like an Englishman, always with a suit and tie. He spoke bad English, Yiddish. He couldn't write his name, but he could read. And I never had any children should be seen and not heard, especially grandchildren. If he saw me, he'd just give me a nickel. And that was it. I don't have any He would sit at the table and preside like a king. And if my grandmother made the soup, he would say in Yiddish, Esther, nehmen the Salz, he needs salt. Come, salt my soup. And she would run around, this little lady who had 8 kids, and kept getting shorter and wider and making babies, and a wonderful lady. And they were really wonderful people. I'll just tell you one anecdote it impacted on my life terribly, and then go to myself and role models. But my grandmother was just very much like my wife. They're social workers. They they take in people, they help people. So many crazy people. I mean, we didn't deal with mental health as an area in that time. But if you had a crazy son, you took him in and you feed him. You say, take it easy, take
Yeah.
it, like that. And one of these crazy, I won't say a-holes, but he was so violent, he kicked my grandfather in the shins, and then my grandfather lost circulation in his feet, and he lost his toes, and then he died. And no good deed goes unturned. And that was a very turning point in my life. I was 13, I was 14, and I want to say it was my first loss. And a lot of life began for me with that incident. I was 13, I had just been bar mitzvahed, and was starting out a new life. And then all of a sudden, my uncle moves to California, and then we moved from the sixth floor. We're living up on the sixth floor. My mother has to schlep up and down. I had two brothers with the tricycles and the grocery bags. My wife saw it. She said, how did they do it? I said, the old-fashioned way. No elevator. You just walk. I mean, when I saw an elevator building, I thought it was a miracle. Mm-hmm. In fact, I taught at Long Island University, and I used to use the stairs. And people said, well, I used to see kids waiting to take an elevator to the second floor and being angry and banging the elevator. And I'm saying to myself, well, just walk up a flight of stairs.
Yeah, do some exercise.
I'm not going to do that. So I used to always walk, just used to walking up and down the stairs. And I live on the 15th floor, and sometimes I walk up and down now. Yeah.
Were you all in the same building?
Well, it was now family is shtetl, family is small community in those glorious years. So my grandmother and grandparent lived on the second floor, and my grandmother's son, my uncle, lived next door, and we lived up on the sixth floor. So I guess somebody moved in and you get apartments for your relatives. My aunt was there, and then I had an uncle around the corner, and it was very small clannish family. And then my grandfather died, my uncle moved, so we moved downstairs, and I lived next to my grandmother. Okay. And it's like an open door policy.
Yeah.
My mother went to work, my father went to work, and I was always with my grandmother, and she was wonderful. And I used to play cards with her all night, and she was lonely, never complaining, but she lost her husband. She was very miserable and unhappy. And then she came and lived with us when we left the tenement, because the Lower East Side was terrible. I mean, it was a very scary place when I think back. I mean, they were overprotective, which as a young boy, it bothered me because I was very short. And my mother made sure that one of my tall friends, Marvin, always walked me to school. Mm-hmm. She was arranging these things. And of course, I understand it now. And I always say it's in the 1950s and everything is changing. The men came back from the war, and Truman put together this fair deal. FDR had the New Deal, so Truman had the Fair Deal, which was slum clearance and urban renewal. So they the city put up these projects, so-called projects, housing developments, and they were beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's just going to be, I'm living in a tenement on the fifth floor, and all the rotten buildings are being knocked down between where we lived on Avenue D and the East River. And then these places called today Lillian Wall, Jacob Riis, and all these buildings went up. And, you say projects, you think about minorities, and you think about, the projects man and all kinds.
Yep.
There was all white. They were World War II veterans, and they had elevators, and they were clean. Mm-hmm. And I used to go, I had friends in the projects. It was like to die and go to heaven is to go to the projects. And it seemed so dramatic what happened. It probably didn't happen overnight, but the Great Flight, African Americans left the South, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and came north for jobs, get away from Jim Crow. And obviously city housing was where they went. And Puerto Ricans were recruited. This was our colony, United States colony, and we're not allowed to talk about that. But, Philippines, United States is an empire. And we had that colony of Puerto Rico we got from Spain. And jobs were offered to Puerto Ricans in factories. The women, the Jewish women, left the factories and stuff like that, Italian women. And so there was this influx of blacks from the South and Puerto Ricans, island people, and they're trying to learn how to live in the Lower East Side. And, kids form gangs. I guess they're left alone. The parents are working. So the Lower East Side became a very scary place for me as a young boy. because I was stopped any number of times and either taken money from routinely. One of the guys got the electric chair. He became such a bad, his name was Willie Mason. I'll never forget him because he was just a thug. He was a black kid from the South who in the South he was probably afraid to lift up his head and look at white people. Because, you know, they had a laughing barrel in parts of the South. If you were a black person in the South, you wanted to laugh in public. First of all, you better get out of the way of white people. And second of all, you had to put your face inside the barrel and laugh in the barrel. You couldn't laugh in public because they thought you're laughing at them and they'll hang you, they'll lynch you. So this kid went wild and actually got the electric chairs, Willie Mason. And his brothers were very nice. His brothers worked for my father, but they always hustled us for money. And the worst thing was we formed a baseball team. So my father got involved in social work. We'll get to that, and my role models. But my father started a baseball team, and we were named the Chiefs. I don't know who made up the name, but we saved money every week. And in each of the apartments of the nine baseball players, 9 kids, we would meet once a week or twice or whatever, once a month, and save $5. And at the end of that, we bought jackets. My father had a friend who had a sporting goods store, and he made us a nice, you know, baseball jacket, and it says Mike 10. My hero was Phil Rizzuto, and it says on the back the Chiefs. Well, one of the gangs was called the Indians, and they didn't like that. And at least one of my friends, Charlie, they stopped him, and they didn't hurt him, but they slashed his jacket, and they took the picture of a chief on the back and said, "You can't be a chief, man, if we're only the Indians." And I'll never forget that. And so we couldn't wear our jackets anymore. And it was very intimidating living down there. And then there's this white flight where all the Jews and Italians and people not of color started moving out. And the area, you know, more and more, you know, I have some of my best friends are Puerto Ricans. My favorite friend ever was Butchie Battle, Herman Butch Battle, who was a young black kid. And, you know, but the area in general was really scary, and there was nobody left. And since my father worked 3 blocks from where we lived, he didn't want to move to a nicer neighborhood. And it was a big family crisis. He didn't want to commute. He never liked to drive. So, because he only could walk 3 blocks to where his boys' club was. So 3 blocks there and 3 blocks home. And it was great for him. But as the area got worse and worse and worse, you know, the handwriting was on the wall. And all of a sudden, middle income apartment buildings were built about a mile away, 2 miles away on Grand Street of the Lower East Side. And so they got an apartment in a high rise. And then we moved in 1960. So I went to college, my first year of college, 1959, 1960, living in a tenement, you know, and it was really something. The teachers were real, the social work teachers were, because I was going to be a social worker because my father was a social worker. And they were amazed. "No, man, you live in a tenement? Would you tell us all about the tenement?" And it's funny, my father had these very wealthy people on his board of directors. And one guy came and was walking around, like looking in the closets, how these poor Jews lived. And and it wasn't bad or anything like that. "Rose, where do you store your towels in the winter?" My mother, you know, and we're 3 brothers. It was 3 bedrooms, 3 tiny bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small living room, and tiny. Now it's tiny. Then it seemed large enough. But he wanted to know because his name was William Mann Parkhurst. He was a famous Park Avenue lawyer, living the luxurious life, and he was a do-gooder, and he'd give money to help my father's cause. So and my mother was beside herself, like this upper class person is going to come and inspect how you live, and we had to clean up and put everything away, and oh my God. And I'll never forget him. Where do you put your winter stuff? And then she showed him how in the small narrow foyer there were these overhead cabinets.
So you said you moved from the tenement to another neighborhood. I mean,
Yeah.
Was it middle income?
Yeah, there was a Mitchell-Lama law, state subsidized housing, and for $3,000 down, you can get a 3-bedroom apartment on the 15th floor. Today it's worth almost $2 million.
Wow.
Because then you didn't own it. It was called a co-op, but you didn't own your apartment, and it was totally subsidized by the state. And eventually they decided to get rid of them. And so, of course, they asked the people like my mother, Rose, do you want us to subsidize and pay for everything, or you want to be able to own it so you could sell it? So everyone went nuts, and they started saying, I want to own it and I want to sell it. And then they began flipping over. My parents, so we couldn't have afforded to live anywhere else. So we moved into this $3,000. They had to put $3,000. I don't think my father had $3,000 to put it down. And there we were. We moved a mile or two away. It was lily white. It was on Grand Street. I don't know what's famous about Grand Street, but the Lower East Side kept, to say Lower East. Today there's something, Chris, when you come down, there's a tenement museum.
Yes.
Which takes you right. So the Lower East Side was around Hester Street. And of course there were people there. The Germans were there before them, and the Indians were. There's always somebody before. But Grand Street is close to Hester Street, and that was the original Lower East Side, where the Jews came anyway. And there were people before the Jews, obviously. And then the Lower East Side began expanding north. So here, basically going back to the original Lower East Side, except that they're high rises, and skyscrapers are like. There's still amazing a skyscraper, and you didn't see many. The Woolworth Building when I was a kid, the Empire State Building, and now, of course, it's incredible. Everything's a high rise. 160 floors. So we moved basically I moved from the fifth. Well, we had an earlier apartment, and I'd love to show you a picture of it. Maybe we can put it on the screen. It's the most graffiti destroyed building in New York City. And the first 5 years of my life were there, and it's amazing. It still is there. I'll show you a picture afterwards, Chris. Maybe you want to post it.
Sure.
It's hilarious. I took my wife there, and it's like I'm a hero. It's like combat pay. You lived there? I said, yeah, I lived there. It was fine. It was okay. It was nothing. It was a dumpy tenement. But, they they make $5, $12 a week. You pay $7 rent. But today it's it's incredible, the graffiti, and it's bordered over, but there it is. And structurally, so we moved from basically Avenue C. I'll tell you a funny story. There's a famous jazz club called the Stone, right next door to the tenement. I live in 2123 Avenue C. So it's between 2nd and 3rd Street. On Avenue C, and down the road, someone named John Zorn, very famous jazz musician, opened up a club called the Stone. And when I did radio shows and we had jazz in my house, I used to go there to interview people. So if you were performing at the Stone, I would go to meet you and listen to you play, and then afterwards sign, do a contract and invite you to come to the show. So I was sitting next to some guy, and he was a hipster. And he was like, oh, yeah, man, the Lower East Side, this is great, man. This area is great, man. You know this area, man? Yeah, man. I said, yeah, oh, yeah, I know this area. He said, yeah, how come? You know this area, man? Where'd you come to this area? I come to... So we're talking like that, and he's talking like that. And I said, you see where we are? He says, yeah, man, this place is cool. This is Stone. I said, I used to get milk here from my mother. And he thought I was talking about drugs. Oh. So he says, oh, yeah, man, that's far out. You got shit here. I said, yeah, milk, from a cow. He used to go down the stairs, go up. And that was the end of the conversation, because I think he didn't want to talk to me anymore. But I thought it was kind of funny.
Yeah.
The way it... And in fact, one of the most famous jazz... I used to go to a movie theater called the American on 3rd Street. Mm-hmm. And the only marquee on the American it said, always splendid features for the entire family. You never knew it was playing unless you looked inside. And the rats would be rolling down that place. And the urine would be... It was the dumpiest movie theater. That became one of the most famous jazz clubs ever, called Slugs.
Okay. That?
Slugs.
Okay.
And Slugs is where Lee Morgan was killed on the bandstand by his wife.
Oh.
She caught him with another woman, and
yep.
She was a junkie, and he was a junkie, and he cleaned her, and then they shut down Slugs. So, places are funny, and they have histories. People have histories. Sometimes it's hard to put the history together, but for me, the Lower East Side and the grocery store, and now, Stone, and this guy, and then around the corner is the movie theater, and then that became a jazz club, and it's just a minor, these are minor things. It makes you feel, they're part of history. It's a rich history, And it's kind of funny. And sometimes people look at you like incredulously, like, really? Is this really? Yeah, you're making this up. I said, yeah, if I make it up, I usually say this is a true story, or I would say this is a false story, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. But it sounds incredulous.
Hmm.
So,
What else? Back to the part about growing up there. Did you said your parents didn't want you playing outside, really, or would they let you play right outside the tenement or go around?
close by, we played in the street. We played stickball in the street, and there were enough friends, and there was few cars. There were very few cars, so we could play stickball, um, and not wander too far. They kept. I mean, they kept close tabs. There was no reason to go. If all of your friends are within eyesight, they're in other apartments in other buildings next door, and a kid, you play games in the street, on the stoop, all kinds of stoop ball, all kinds of games. I remember once I was catching, and there's a boy named Barry, and he hit on his backswing, and I had a big lump on my forehead. I must have been too close to the batter, and I was catching. And then my grandfather came down the street, I think it was, with a coin, like a 25 cents, and they put it on my forehead, and they pressed it back. So there are a lot of stories. I mean, you have stories as a kid. I have a traumatic story about they were playing stickball. I played a little bit stickball, but I remember there was a guy named Whitey, and the ball landed on the fire escape outside my grandmother's window, and he
Hmm.
reached for it, and the fire escape came down. He lost his
Oh.
arm, and so I'm very afraid of amputation. I think I
Yeah.
had this like really traumatic. It was just a traumatic thing with screaming and ambulances and innocence of playing in the street. So it
Hmm.
wasn't dangerous like that. Nobody was run over. I had a dog. The dog ran away and got run over by a car, but it was basically safe in the streets. But my father had a settlement house,
Hmm.
so you would go to the boys' club. Started in the boys' club, and I was a member of the boys' club on Avenue A and 10th Street, and it was wonderful. We had teams, and we had swimming, and I've told people stories in junior high school. I went to junior high school 71, 64 and 71. We had to go to gym in the boys' club, and we had swimming. Radio listeners, turn off your sets. We swam naked. Okay, no bathing suits, like 75 boys, and radio listeners, turn off. Before we were allowed to go into the pool, we lined up. We had to face the wall. We had to bend over, and whoever the swim instructor was would come by, and I don't know what he was checking for, but he sure was checking our butts for whatever he was checking them for. And then we were allowed to splash
Just
around.
allowed to go in the pool,
Yeah,
and
yeah, splash around like nuts.
it was
But
normal. Just
it was like, I didn't make that up. So right away, someone said, "Oh, come on, man, you made that." I said, "I did not make that up." And I have a couple of friends who could verify. But I mean, it's some of those crazy. But we had the settlement house. My father got the settlement house, and then, frankly, Chris, it was bondage, because if your father has a business, that's the end of your life, unless you're a runaway. And in some ways, I was a runaway, because he had a boys club, and the ages were from 13 to 18, and at 18 you left. You couldn't participate, except that, so I had to give up the boys club and go to join with bring in all my friends to help him. And he had, as one, I'll talk about the club. It was basically like based on New York City, a municipal government. They had an elected mayor. They had it was a concept that started in Chicago. I think Jack London started it. In fact, the famous novel by Herzog. I'm blocking on the name for a minute. I'll get it in a minute. I'm blocking on the minute for what? That's so silly. I guess, is it Herzog? I think it was Herzog. He has a scene from the BBR, and it started in Chicago, and a man came to New York and basically collected kids who were in the streets and said, "Do you boys want to go to a boys club?" And the boys said, "Yeah," instead of playing in the streets and getting in trouble and getting dirty. So this man, Harry Eastlanica, started a boys club. My father was one of the first kids in, and it saved his life, because my father was like these, like Mexican kids, like they're in the Zoot Suit riot. they didn't have an identity. The parents were working in the fields. So if you know about the zoot suit riots, these Mexican kids emulated blacks from the 30s. Cab Calloway with zoot suits. And they're wearing these flashy zoot suits, and the whites couldn't stand them. Who are these like uppity Mexican kids? So my father and his friends all of a sudden are wearing suits and ties. They're these immigrant kids in the street. And this man, Harry Slonica, wore a suit and tie and his hat like a gangster like George Rat. And these kids went into the club, and he straightened them out. And then later on, my father took over that club. They invited him to be the director of it. And then he became a role model for thousands of kids, black kids. What he did, my father's, to me, a hero, anti-hero. Because he's definitely a hero, and it's amazing what he did. But he's one of those guys, like a football coach. They give up the family life for the job. And you're either part of it, program, or you're not part of it. If you're not part of it, you're... And so I was part of it till I was 18, and then I worked for him for 5 years doing different things. And when I broke, I think he was furious with me because it's a store and it's like the mob. You're supposed to be part of it. You can't just like suddenly.
As like well, even within the family, they want you to continue on.
Oh, yeah.
But was that the same with your grandparents' candy store?
Well, that's before my time. I think the grandparents are immigrants and they wanted their kids out to go get education.
Yeah.
My grandmother had no education. My grandfather had no education. They wanted him to go to school, maybe to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, not a shoemaker, and my parents were already Americanized. So they're dressed, they're American. If you asked my father what language he spoke, he would say American. And everything was General Electric products or better, Ronald Reagan on television. Everything was television. Everything like it was, all the spirituality, all the religion was gone. There were I hate to say this. Once my father was interviewed, and someone like you, Chris, would be saying to someone like Ralph Hittman, "Oh, Ralph, would you tell us about your father and your mother?" And he said, "They're dead." And the radio went silent. He couldn't talk about them. And they were these struggling immigrants, And then, of course, at the end of his life, he's starting to speak Yiddish, and he's, they tell the stories when it's too late. Yeah. But it was my father had no coat. He had to share a coat with his father. My father used to sleep on the dining room table. He couldn't wait to get out of that house. And his parents, I think he was ashamed of them, and they were penniless. They lived... My God, my grandmother had a cat because of rats. I'll never forget my other grandmother. And he just couldn't wait to get out and to be an American, to put on a suit and tie. You don't wear brown shoes during the week. You wear brown shoes on Saturday. All these rules. And he had the settlement house, and it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. It was tough for myself and my brothers because, frankly, every time I walked into a room and the guys were talking, they would shut up. Because my father was a very difficult guy. He's a very rough guy. And they loved him. They hated him. They loved him. They hated him. And you couldn't talk about Ralph in front of Michael. So I always had this chill. Like if I go into a room and guys were around, I was like, take my deep breath. Like, oh, man, take it easy. And let him, hey, Mike, what's going on? Hey, okay. They wouldn't badmouth him in front of me. And I the shock of my life once was... so my father's like a hero, but in many ways, an anti-hero. Like this football coach with Kansas City, the Chiefs. One son became a drug addict, and the other son, was in a car accident and killed like a little 4-year-old, and the whatever that guy's name is.
I think his last name's Reed.
Yeah. Oh yeah. He's got the game plan for next week. He's too busy.
Yeah.
The Pennsylvania coach, his assistant was sodomizing, players in the showers. Remember? And Joe Paterno said, I don't know. I'm busy preparing the game plan. My father found this world to run the settlement house, and it was the world for him. He worked from 9 to 10 at night. He couldn't, and if he came home to sit around he was not interested in helping with homework. I'm saying that good things and bad. He's my hero, my anti-hero. And then the weekend he'd work Saturdays, and then Sunday was a bust because you got to deal with your own family. But bring in friends, and then he had a summer camp, and he loved the summer. So myself and my two brothers, we always were involved as kids, and then as workers. We worked for him, and then at a certain point, when I went to graduate school, it was almost like a betrayal, where I said, I'm not going to, I'm not going to go to the summer camp and work.
You're not going to continue
I'm
doing
not
it.
going to do it.
Yeah.
I ain't going to work on Maggie's farm no more.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked at the NYU library. I was a graduate student. And it was a break. And even to this day, because his business went under, and my wife doesn't believe this, but I still feel guilty. Like I should have taken it over, and maybe I could have saved it. That's a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I could have saved it. But almost like guilt, because my youngest brother basically try to really help him and take it over. Then my father got really close to my youngest brother. So long story short, that was, all of that stuff was pivotal. So that's pivotal. And, the candy store is wonderful because we had a recipe. This is,
Yeah.
Egg creams were the favorite 5 cents drink that to die for. Mm-hmm. There were places that made this famous egg cream, and you can get a pretzel, stick a rod, and an egg cream. And it was a place. It's on Avenue B now. There's a Clinton Street Bakery is across the street. So I'm going to tell you an anecdote that I love. My father's best friends, Sid and Howie Davis, owned this. And hey kid, I go in and they say, hey kid, what do you want? And I put my nickel down, and they would whip it up with their own recipe. And using that seltzer from the spring,
yeah.
Foaming it
Yep.
and whipping it up, and wiping off the top like a beer. And it was the best drink in the world. Mm. And then this bullshit with the fox syrup came about, and people started saying, this is how you make an egg cream. And
they just, like, from then on, it changed.
The homemade jobs, but I'm getting to my grandparents. Yeah. These guys they didn't have commercial. Fox didn't exist. They didn't have the product. They had to make their own chocolate syrup. Mm-hmm. And they had recipes for making chocolate syrup, which is not rocket science. So they all had their own recipes. Okay. So, and then like the culture, like the professionalism, everything was Fox, you bet. And if you really want an egg cream, you go there and they make it. And that ain't no egg cream. My grandparents had one of those recipes. Okay, and these two men, Sid and Howie Davis, said, I used to use your grandparents' recipe. So one day, my brother went to Sid and Howie, they were retired, and got the recipe. And we were hanging out, and they made the egg creams. I said, oh, this is the real deal. Where'd you get it? Oh, we got it from my brothers, two brothers. We got it from Sid and Howie. Mm. So I said, can we have it? And my brothers said to me, no, you can't have it, Mike. They gave it to us. It's for us. It's ours. Well, Mike was like so pissed off and furious. Hey, what you mean? Yeah, we can't do it. We gave him our promise. So one day there was a function, and there was this guy, one of them, Sid Davis, in a wheelchair. So I went over to talk to him. I said, how are you? Oh, life sucks. I'm in a wheelchair. It sucks getting old. So I said, Sid, I got to ask you a question. I said, you were nice. You gave Jeff and Steve, my brothers, the recipe, but they don't want to share it with me. You think I could ask you for it? He said, I'll have to think about it. So we go around and we're visiting it with some kind of whatever reunion. At the end, I went over. He says, hey, kid, come here. And he says, here's the recipe. And he says it so fast, like, 2 pounds of sugar, you need 4 pounds of... So I had my wife come over. Says, just a second. And she wrote it down. And so I got the recipe. And so we went home and my two daughters, and we made a batch of it. I could give you the recipe. And it's fantastic.
Is it exactly like how you remember it? Exactly
as I remember it. But you can't just open a bottle of seltzer and pour it in. You need one of those, with the metal, the power. You need to. So here's my brother. One of them is going to come to visit. And I was furious with them just for that. But, furious. And we made a batch of it, and we put it all over the refrigerator. And, we put it like about 12 bottles of it. And my brother came, as always, he said, "Hey, you got any cold to drink, man? You got anything to drink?" I said, "Yeah, Jeff, go get some whatever you want in the refrigerator." And we've watched him. He opens the refrigerator, and he sees all these bottles, and he turns like he's gonna kill me. He said, Jackie Gleason.
Yeah.
I said, "It's okay." I said, "Stephen gave me the recipe. I wanted to divide and conquer." He said, "He gave you the recipe? Bullshit." And he left. He ran out of my house. He slammed the door. And it was a funny story. And that's the story. So we have the recipe.
Wow.
And but that's so the candy store reverberates.
Yeah.
And
you, was it just you would go for the vanilla or the chocolate?
well, or a piece of candy. The candy stores had ice cream.
Okay.
Fresh ice cream. And I didn't have an ice box. And I had a horse when I was a kid. The horse would deliver apples on 6th Street. There was a horse that would come up the street with apples, and the guy would yell, "Hey, Gippo, apples!" And he buys fresh. And they had the push carts all along Avenue C. LaGuardia was the one who got rid of the push carts, and they created indoor markets.
Oh.
But from Houston Street all the way up to about 10th Street, you would go and buy. Somebody sold bagels, somebody sold pickles, somebody sold, and you would just go like that and shop. That was wonderful. These people are out in the cold weather, 24, every day of the year, and so if you went to a candy store, it's either to buy the newspaper, nobody delivers, the Daily Mirror for 2 cents, the Daily News for 2 cents, the Herald Tribune, the Post in the afternoon. PM. We didn't drink. The Times was way, it wasn't it was way too classy. The Herald Tribune, and some candy. A malted was also a very
That's...
So that was a candy store. So my grandfather apparently played cards all night with guys.
Just in the back.
There's no business. Yeah, there's no business. And during the day, my grandmother would make the drinks and sell the penny candy and do the business, and my grandfather would sleep.
Wow.
And that was their life. I mean, my mother, everything fell on my mother because there were 8 kids and 4 of them died. She had to take care of all of her younger siblings. She had to go to school. She had to shop for the grocery store, the candy store. She had to go and get.
Yeah.
So that was a very tough life for my parents. And they worked hard, man. They really, nobody got burnt out. We went to a store. A couple of years ago, we went neighborhood in Brooklyn, and guy opened a restaurant. It's really nice. 2 brothers. So I said, "Hey, this is a really nice place. How you guys doing?" "Well, we're trying." And a couple of months later, we go back. He says, "Hey, Mike," he said, "I'm getting out." I said, "Why?" He says, "I'm burnt out." And I remember I said, I shouldn't have said this. I said, "Gee, my wife's grandfather opened up this optometry place like for 52 years. He never burnt out." The guy looks at me. He said, "My father, my mother." He said, and he got in my face. He said, "If I say I'm burnt out, I'm burnt out." So I said, "Okay, go flame out. Get the hell." So it's different work. I worked for 46 years as a professor. My wife worked for like 37 years. I'm not bragging. But that's the way it was, and nobody will ever. I don't think anybody will live that way. It was hard work, man. But you're supposed to work hard. You're not supposed to be sitting in a hammock, but why not? But you live long, you go to Florida, those people. But that's symbolically like the candy store.
Yes.
I mentioned the Hebrew school. They forced us to go to Hebrew school, and it's ironic that my parents and even my grandparents, they didn't celebrate. Like, for example, Passover was a big, it's a big Jewish holiday. Egypt, Moses getting out of slavery. And it was in Hebrew school that I learned about Passover and a Seder. And then we would do it in my house because they did it in this. But Hebrew school was where I learned how to play basketball. So I was going to tell you about these role models. You asked me about role models, and it just relates to that.
Sure.
So my parents are a given. My father's a hero. My mother, I started to say, I thought she was a saint, but the guys who worked for my mother didn't necessarily love her because she wasn't their mother. She was my mother. And I remember one guy used the B word and said, "Your mother's a bitch." And I was like, "What?" He's talking about my mother. It's not like I wanted to fight or anything, but like, I can't believe anybody would say that about
Yeah.
this suffering, wonderful woman. So people are complex. But now we
Hmm.
talk about role models. Since you asked me, you got one of those questions, and it
Sure.
relates to all of this. So my first, forget my father. My first role model was a retarded guy. So that says a lot for me. But the thing was, we'd learned how to play basketball in the Hebrew school and it had a low ceiling, so you couldn't shoot a high arching shot.
Oh, it was really it
It
was
was a
really
low
low.
ceiling, and in that era, the two-handed set shot.
Hmm.
There's three things with basketball: the two-handed set shot, then somebody invented the one-handed shot, and then came the jump shot.
Hmm.
So in the evolution of basketball, my own game, because I played basketball for 50 years, I'm learning how to shoot. And this guy, his name was Lenny Bodner, and he must have been retarded because
Hmm.
all he did was come there and shoot and never miss in a low ceiling. And I thought he was going to play.
He never said anything. He just
Nah,
went in there
nah,
and.
he just played. And then we'd choose up sides. He always picked me because I couldn't shoot. So I'd throw the ball to him and he would shoot. And I swear he never missed. So I remember once I went home and professional basketball just started, the NBA and the Knicks. Now, they're not on television, but I remember I was a stupid kid and I was 12. I said, "Hey, Dad, I play with somebody. I think he could play for the Knicks." And I remember my father said, "How tall is he?" And I said, like you, he said, "That's ridiculous. He's too small for the NBA." And I was furious with my father. But meanwhile, here's this guy, and there was something about him that when I started to write fiction, he was one of my first stories was about a kid who's confused because he shoots the two-handed shot, whereas his father shoots the one-handed shot. And he's
Hmm.
torn between, like, and then all of a sudden somebody comes along with a jump shot, and then he's really screwed. He doesn't know what the hell to do, which is what happened to me. It's really weird. I have a better one-handed shot. My jump shot's okay, and it seems stupid to shoot a set shot.
Mm.
They don't do it anymore. Now they do it with the three-point shot because
Yes,
you have
yes.
to. So long story short, I made up a story, and I don't know now, Chris. I don't know if I made this up or not. I don't think I made this up, but that guy, who he had to be retarded. He lived across the street with his mother, and he'd come every day to play the basketball, and then he'd go to the services. They'd have religious services every night,
Hmm.
and he'd go home, and he'd go across the street. He never worked. He never talked. I saw him in my schoolyard. I went to public school 15 with a baseball glove and a ball and a thick composition notebook. And he's pitching. And he throws a pitch against the wall. And then he takes out his notebook and he writes ball one. And he's having this, he's retarded,
All in his head.
all in his head. But it was fascinating.
Mm.
Somebody learned how to use time for himself in a way that's not destructive. And he became like a hero to me. I never met him later on.
You don't know what happened to him, but it just stuck with you.
It
Just
absolutely stuck with me for some of those reasons. And then there was another guy who's another kind of hero, and then I'll get to better heroes. And his name is Leo Brendler, and he didn't work. He never worked.
Mm.
Work is like, you don't work. It's like you're threatening the whole the American capitalism is going to. And he was just so effed up, or whatever. He just didn't work. What did he do all day? He just hung around. He just came down. He went to hang out with my father. He was the nicest guy you would ever imagine. He just never worked. Why doesn't Leo get a job? Why? And the conversation is like, we had a neighbor who was a writer, and he wrote all day and he walked all afternoon. And people would say, why doesn't he get a job? People who would buy novels and would love to read novels, and maybe knowing or not knowing that writers have to spend a lot of time writing, and then they have to, spend time thinking. So here's Don. I won't say his last name. So now here's Leo, who doesn't do anything. He just doesn't do anything. There are no. I think he might have been in the army. He graduated high school. He was the nicest guy you could imagine. Why doesn't he work? Why doesn't he work? Why doesn't he get married? And he became a friend of my brothers and myself. Eventually, he went to work for my father. Eventually, he got a job, but it inspired me to write a story about someone who worked in the dead letters department in the post office. And this, I don't need to go into the story. When he reads a letter to God, and it changes his whole life. Somebody wrote a letter to God, and he refuses to burn it. The supervisor says you have to burn the dead letters, and he just can't. And it's a story. But Leo is another character, and my ears. And then I worked for my father in the summer camp, and my father had a chef. Summer camps, of course, had chefs, and I was 14, and my father stuck me in the kitchen as I don't want to say a slave, but I worked like a beast in the kitchen. Now, I wasn't the strongest kid, but I worked. I was the assistant chef. Oh man, I used to cook 12 pounds of bacon every Sunday. I ate a pound. I used to shuck 124 years of curd, do chicken. I worked, and the man that I worked for was one of the greatest people. He's still alive, and he was the brother of a very famous jazz musician. The jazz musician's name is Calvin Jackson, and he played on, anybody who knows jazz, he recorded on Columbia, and his younger brother Charles was not a famous musician, was not a good musician, but he was a wannabe trumpet player. So here's this young man who was probably 32, and I'm like 14, and he's listening to, I'll drop two names, Clifford Brown, great Clifford Brown, great trumpet player who died very, very young in a car accident. Was a great trumpet, wonderful person, and Chet Baker, who became, the famous Chet Baker.
Yes.
And Charlie's listening to this stuff just when I'm listening to Alan Freed. This is just when Alan Freed breaks. And I'm like, me and my friends, we had a doo-wop group. We're singing in the high school. We're trying. Everybody wants to be a doo-wop group. Oh my God, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Like the video I asked you to look at. The Platters, the Willie Winfield and the harp tones. And these are now my friends. I got friends with these people. Tony Middleton, who's still alive. Tony Middleton and the Willows. Church bells may ring. We love you, darling. The angels will sing. Doing that. And I'm listening to rock and roll. And in the room next door, where we in the camp, is Charlie, and he's listening to Clifford Brown, like, well, that's stuff, and he's practicing his trumpet. And the punchline to all of this is, we worked like a beast, and when we rested, it was like the military. You got an hour off between meals, and then you got to go back to meal. I never slept so well. I'm watching Amos and Andy. Okay, the black TV show, Amos and Andy, not the radio show. The radio show were these white guys in blackface. And I won't do an imitation, but I never liked them. I thought but the television show actually had African Americans. And in my head, I knew, well, they're creating work. I never laughed at them.
When did that come out
Well, Jesus, in the 50s.
50s?
Bill Cosby, allegedly, the famous pervert, Bill Cosby, apparently bought, it was Cosby or it was Harry Belafonte. They bought all of the episodes, and they're not around. You can see an old episode. You decide for yourself if it's any more racist than Sanford and Son or some of those, the Jeffersons.
Yeah, I thought all the Norman Lear.
Yeah, all of those. So this was Amos and Andy, and there was a character, the Kingfish, and then he was a hustler, and there was a character, Andy, who was kind of like, slow, and there was the character Lightning, and then the wife. So the punchline to the story was, during a break, I sit down, Charlie's practicing, and I turn on Amos and Andy. And I would say, whatever racism is, and everybody's got to have some racism, you have bad incidents, you think about race, and then you realize somebody beat me up, he was a black kid, I don't hate all black, And Charlie came over and he said, turn that shit off, man. I never even asked him why, but it was a moment, like a moment of truth. And I love this man. He took me places. He used to take me to Birdland. I went to see the original Birdland with Charlie Jackson. He took me to the Randall's Island Jazz Festival in Randall's Island, the East River. We used to go to St. George Hotel to swim, and he was great. So Jackson got me into jazz. I all of a sudden, and I became snooty, like rock and roll was lesser music. This is a bad thing to say.
Compared to jazz.
Yeah, and then my brother was younger than me, and my brother became a jazz musician as a result of that. And then it was just one more related thing, and then we'll get there. So
Sure.
I mentioned these guys, Charlie Jackson, sort of jazz, and then these two losers. And Leonard Cohen wrote a beautiful book called Beautiful Losers,
Oh, yes,
his
yes,
first novel, his second
yes.
novel. And these guys are beautiful losers. Certainly Leo was an innocent, wouldn't hurt a fly. What a nice guy. But he
Mm.
was effed up until he finally, and he wound up actually, Leo got a job in the post office. That was his job. So he had a career in the post office. And then he worked for my father as a driver. He never had any children. He got married and he died. And one more name, and then the whole thing will come together.
Sure.
The last person who had a major impact on my life, his name was Bora Bergman. And I say it because the last time I did this, Chris, it reminds me, Bonnie Grice had a show called The Song Is You on WLIU radio. It was on every Friday night. And she would interview people about music in their lives, very famous people. And they interviewed me not because I was a very famous person, but because they gave me a radio show. We'll talk about the radio station. So I remember I went out to Southampton, and I came out for the weekend. And of course, we have the house in Southold, which we're going to talk about. I discovered Southampton because, first of all, I was offered a job on the Southampton campus, which I never took. I was a bachelor. It was a long winter, I was told. And then the radio station, the Long Island University, owned the Southampton campus, and they decided they smelled money, I think, with jazz in 2000. The Millennium started a radio station, WLIU, NPR station. And because of federal money with the storms, and, hurricanes, they got money. And they got a tower, and they had a station, and I was given a show. But I did something with Bonnie Grice. She interviewed me, like introducing Michael Hittman is going to be doing a new show called In the Pocket or whatever it was called. So I came out and I spent an hour. She said, bring some music and we'll talk. So I brought something from Bora Bergman, and it was a piano piece. And he was a jazz piano player that I met. And he became one of the really powerful influences in my life. And meeting him introduces, if I can say, like, now we'll go to the second part of this concept of I forgot what Freud called them. It's like serendipity. They're synchronicities. I forgot the word in German, but the notion of it's impossible for this to happen with that, and yet those two things happened. How's that possible? And Freud was absolutely baffled because he was such a scientist and such a rigorous mind, and he and Jung, that when patients would report things, you couldn't possibly know this. This person couldn't possibly know this, and yet they did. And Freud was always amazed at least he left open, that there are things we can't explain without saying God, say God, and that's the end of it. So these things started happening to me that are really airy. And I'll start with Bora Bergman. I was a kid working in the summer camp for Charles Jackson, who was a jazz musician, and Charlie had friends who were jazz musicians. And one day, this very kind of interesting, handsome man came with another guy, a black guy, Charles. So another Charles and this man named Bora Bergman they came to visit Jackson. And I was just hanging out as a 14-year-old. And they took this guy, Bora Bergman, to the piano, and it was an old upright, and he started playing like very crazy, avant-garde, but there was all broken keys, and then he stopped. And that was it. I never thought about that guy again. But fast forward like about 10 years, I developed a friendship with someone, and it was like a love triangle. I got engaged to someone who was in love with someone else, and this someone else got cancer and was dying.
Oh.
And I became friendly with the someone else, and I was proving my manhood. This is sad to say, but the woman I was engaged to was just to talk about this other guy in such glowing terms, and I was very insecure about my relationship with this woman, and I wanted to know who this other guy was. I just like macho, and I courted him, and I got friendly, and I really fell in love with him. He was a wonderful guy. Unfortunately, he had cancer and he died. And at the funeral, All of a sudden, this guy, Bora Bergman, shows up. Somebody sits down and plays a tribute to Stephen Flaxman, who just died. And Stephen was a playwright and a poet, and very interesting. And Chris, he had like MS. He had only one arm and one,
Oh,
and he was crippled. You never saw a better motorcycle rider than him. His one
yeah.
arm was so strong,
Wow.
and his leg was so strong. I rode with him, and I'm going to say, I knew a woman in intimate ways, and she told me that she slept with him, and she never realized he was a cripple until the morning. So he must have been a hell of a lover. He wouldn't take two arms. But he was an amazing guy. And
Yeah.
the point is, I met this character, Bora Bergman, and I said, I know you. Do you remember me? Oh, yeah, Charles Jackson. Oh, yeah, yeah. And we became friends. And that's astonishing, because at the same time, my brother Jeff, my younger brother, started playing the saxophone. And I'm going to do one more mystical story. My brother, on his own, they gave my brother clarinet lessons. And my brother was at war with my parents, because he said, I'm not going to play Jewish klezmer music. They wanted him, he was good. He was very talented. And they said, you'll be a musician, you'll play Jewish music, you'll play weddings and bar mitzvahs, you'll make a living. And that's all the parents got to do, is get him out and get a job. And my brother was like just rock hard oppositional to his father and his mother. I ain't going to do that. And he says, I like jazz. Fine. They got him a saxophone, and he picked this man out of his hat, Sonny Rollins.
Mm.
And he loved Sonny Rollins. Where it came from, I don't know. He was playing Sonny, and at home on 6th Street in the tenement, he's playing Sonny Rollins records and learning the solos and, playing them. So we talked about, we left the tenement and we moved to Grand Street. And we move into Grand Street, and I tell you this is the birth of my loss of sanity. Well, everything changed. We move in, and two things happen. First of all, my mother leaves her purse on the railing, and a guy comes in and steals her purse. I'm sleeping on the couch. I hear something. We moved, I was tired, and I hear something, and I see a guy run out, and I run after him. He runs down the stairs with the purse. That was the first thing. Oh my God, he stole the purse. Oh my God, we didn't lock the door. Oh my God, oh my God. And then went over to the window in my grandmother's bedroom, because my grandmother lived with us. We're 5 people and 6 as grandma. I look out the window and I see Sonny Rollins in the street. Sonny Rollins is very old. He's 93 or 4. He's on a walker. The Williamsburg Bridge is going to be named the Sonny Rollins Bridge, but these people can't wait until he dies, until they can rename it. Sonny Rollins was the saxophonist in 1950. He was the man, just before John Coltrane became the man. In saxophone talk, Coleman Hawkins was the man, and Lester Young developed another style of playing. And the tenor saxophone is like the biggest erection in music you can have, and that's the instrument. If you want to be a man, you play the tenor saxophone, not the little alto like Charlie Parker played. And that's the man. You play this. Sonny played the tenor. He was an incredible, great man, great person, and he took a sabbatical. I have a theory he took a sabbatical. It's not original, because he heard John Coltrane, and he was so competitive, Sonny. He just needed to go away, and he had been through drugs, and he hated playing. Sonny told me he hated playing nightclubs because everyone smoked, and he couldn't even dry clean his suits to get rid of the smoke, and he had to buy new clothes, and he didn't like spending the money, and he took a year sabbatical. He's my brother's guy. My brother's playing Sonny note for note. I'm at the window, just looking out the window. I ain't bothering anybody. And there's Sonny Rollins in the street. I said, Jeff. So he comes running in. I said, there's Sonny. And we run down 15 flights of stairs, and we follow him. And Sonny's probably 32 years old. So I'm like, I'm 18. My brother's 15. And we follow him, and he goes into a building on Grand Street. And we just stop at the door, and we look, and it says Sonny Rollins. So, wow. My uncle Elliot was a jazz musician and a DJ. and he played in a big band. Charlie Barnes played the saxophone. So we call up Uncle Elliot, and Elliot had a lot of balls because he was a man, so he wrote a note. He said, "Dear Sonny Rollins, my name is Elliot Ashby, and I'm from W radio station FMU FUCK FU, like that. And my nephew loves your music and would love to meet you." So Sonny calls up. She says, "Well, why don't you come over?" So my Uncle Elliot and my brother Jeff and me, we go over. We knock on the door. We go in, and there's Sonny in a small room on a slant board, doing mouth exercises, living monastically. He's married. His wife Lucille works at NYU, and he's on sabbatical, and he's practicing on the bridge. There's a famous album called The Bridge. That's the Williamsburg Bridge.
Oh.
That's the one they're going to name the Sonny Rollins Bridge. As soon as he dies, hurry up, Sonny, don't die. It's amazing. You need $40,000 to change all the signs and all of the politicians. And so long story short, we go meet Sonny, and Sonny was very nice to my brother. And the one question he asked my brother is the following. He says, "Jeffrey, you want to be a jazz musician?" My brother said, "Yeah, I want to be a jazz musician like you, Sonny." He says, "Are you going to use drugs, Jeffrey?" My brother knew what drugs were. And he says, oh, no, Mr. Rollins. Punchline is my brother used every drug there was and died, of an overdose. And it's unbelievable. But he was the best friends ever with Sonny. Sonny Rollins told me every time I drive past Grand Street, I'd break down and cry. I love Jeff. Everyone loved my brother Jeff. He was a holy fool. He was a beautiful loser. He was a saint. And he could not stay out of the way of drugs and could not stop destroying him. I smoked a cigarette. I coughed. I said, "This is stupid." My brother smoked a cigarette. The next thing he was
kept going.
Yeah. There's addictive personalities and all of that stuff. And I became very, very friendly with Sonny Rollins and was asked to write his biography. This thing called synchronicity is absolutely bizarre because not only did we get to see Sonny Rollins and get to meet him, my brother's hero, just because we moved, like the day we moved. June 1st, I'm working on a book, and we contacted a woman who did copy editing for my last book. I don't like talking that way. Oh, my latest book, my next book. I did a book called Great Basin Indians. We'll get to Native Americans in a minute. And anyway, her name was Annette, and I don't want to say her last name because she just did something bad to me. But she called up and she said, maybe we can work together on your new book. So I said, that'll be great. So I said, "Hey, Annette, what have you been up to?" So this is the question. Gee, I haven't spoken to you for 10 years. Annette, how you doing? How's your father? How's your mother? How's your father? How's your wall? How's your door? How's your, I hate that. I do all that formal stuff just to get it out of the way, but I mean it. And I like when people ask me how I'm doing, so I do it. So she says, "You're asking me what I've been doing." She said, "Do you know anything about jazz?" Oh, did I have 175 shows? I played jazz in a big band. I know a lot about jazz. My brother's a jazz. She said, "Yeah, I know a little bit about jazz." So she said, "Have you ever heard of someone named Sonny Rollins?" So I said, and I'm looking out the window, same window, I'm in the same room where he was in the grocery store.
Where you'd see him.
Yeah, and I'm saying, "Yeah, I know Sonny Rollins. What's up?" She said, "Oh, I just finished a biography by so-and-so. And if you're interested, you ought to look at this book." So I told her the story of Sonny Rollins and how it overlaps with my life and how I'm on the phone with him now. And I'm not going to write his biography. It's too late now anyway. But he asked me to write an authorized biography. And then he said to me, "Oh, Mike, I don't want to die. I don't want to sit and go back over my life. It's too depressing." So this guy wrote an unauthorized book and cut and paste, and it's probably a good book. And he sent it to Sonny. Chris, if you got presented with a 400-page book about your life, what are you going to do? So you're right. Say, "Oh, it's very good in this thing." And that's the story. And I'm not unhappy. But the point of all of this is that's another synchronicity. That's just not believable. So here we go. We moved to 415 Grand Street from 745 East 6th Street. So 415 Grand. When I go to Albuquerque, I had 2 apartments. The second apartment, guess what? Give me the address. 415 Grand. And then I do this, and I'm not a Kabbalist Jews who do numbers, but there are people who everything is in, like the letter A in the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph is number one, the letter B is, and they do numeral, my mother does that all the time. I meet my wife, guess where she lives? 415. Grant, not grand, with a T. But my favorite player was Phil Rizzuto. His number was 10. 4 and 5 is 1 is 10, right? I get that. So I'm starting to have, and I have 2 notebooks full of things that happen okay.
So we're going to stop right there for part 1 with Michael Hittman. I hope you enjoyed that first part. And for part 2, we're going to continue on with him discussing his time in college and his interest in anthropology, as well as his time working out in Nevada with the Native Americans, and eventually coming up to his time now with working on the Brooklyn Paramount Theater. We'll probably have part 2 out sometime this week as well. So thank you again for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you soon.